Greetings. In this video we're going to see 3 short videos that my wife took on our recent trip to Greece. The first one is at the supposed home of Mary, the mother of Jesus, at Ephesus. We stopped there before we went to the ruins at Ephesus. And this is supposedly where Mary stayed with John, who was given the care of Mary by Jesus on the cross. And so we know John went to Ephesus, and so the tradition is that Mary went with him, and that this is where she stayed. Kind of doubt it, but hey, that's all right. There is a tradition that goes back. Maybe that's where it was. But anyway, in anticipation of this, I wanted to help our guests, our tour guests, think about Mary. We're Protestants, and so as Protestants, we're very skeptical of Mary. And as I mentioned in this video, that may not be totally helpful. And so I explained that even Catholics and Orthodox are not supposed to worship Mary. And then I talked about how Mary is the mother of God, which is like really strange for Protestant ears. So I explained that in this video. So we're going to start with that one, and then we'll go to a couple more talks. But a lot of Protestants are saying, you know what, we probably overdid it. Mary was a wonderful woman. She's blessed in the scripture, and we're blessed by thinking about her. And in fact, in our age of gender confusion, there are Christians who are saying we should probably recapture Mary's virtue as a woman and use her as a model for what a godly woman is like. So I encourage you that way. Now, there's one other thing I want to point out, is it's weird to think of Mary as the mother of God. This is something Protestants agree with. Even though we're kind of nervous about that, it's important to understand why they made this declaration. Jesus is one person with two natures, a divine nature and a human nature. He's not two persons. He's not two persons mashed together. He's one person. So the argument that Mary is not the mother of God is the argument that Mary gave birth to the physical body of Jesus Christ, his humanity. And then later, usually at the baptism, the divine nature was glommed onto him. All right? And the Christians said that's heresy. Jesus needs to be fully God and fully man. Otherwise, we're not saved. All right? And so they said, no, Mary gave birth to God. It sounds crazy, doesn't it? As a Protestant, it sounds like, oh, really? Yes, and it's important to understand that. Now, she didn't give birth like to God in the beginning. But she did give birth to God in the form of Jesus Christ, one person with two natures. So I just wanted to, hopefully that adds something to your experience here. Excuse me. Okay, now this next one is at Berea, or as they say in Greece, Berea or Veria. Our guide was like, quit saying Berea, it's Veria. And so you hear me say Veria in this video, as well as Thessaloniki and Philippi, which we would say in our English-speaking world, we'd say Philippi and Thessalonica. So we were actually really nicely following Paul down Greece. So I given a talk at Philippi already, and then we sort of made our way down to past a couple other places mentioned in the book of Acts. You'll hear me mention those, and then to Thessalonica, and then to Berea. And so we stopped there. It's really not much to see there. This is where the Bereans, as we would say, was a place where they read the Bible to check out what Paul was saying, make sure that it was reliable. And so there's a monument there, and so I read some scripture at that place, just a short video. So this is Acts chapter 17, and we already read a little bit in 17 when we talked about when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia. So Acts 16 is Philippi, not to be mistaken, not to be confused with Philippi, is Philippi that we were at yesterday. And then he went down through Amphipolis and Apollonia. So after his imprisonment, and the magistrates came and got him out, asked him to leave. He left. He went through Amphipolis and Apollonia, came to Thessalonica, where we were last night. Then we just mentioned briefly how he was preaching there, and some of them believed. A lot of people believed, men and women believed. I read that, I think, yesterday. But then some people came and disturbed the preaching in Thessaloniki, and they turned the world upside down, and these all do contrary to the decrees of Caesar. That's where I was reading then about the problem that he was experiencing there, was he was preaching a king other than the emperor. And so, and they were that offended the Thessalonians. They were very concerned about that. So then it says, and when they had taken security of Jason and of the other, they let them go. And the brethren immediately sent away Paul and Silas by night unto Berea, who coming thither went into the synagogue of the Jews. These are more noble than those in Thessaloniki, in that they received the word with all readiness of mind, and searched the scriptures daily, whether those things were so. Therefore many of them believed, also of honorable women which were Greeks, and of men not a few. But when the Jews of Thessaloniki had knowledge that the word of God was preached to Paul at Berea, they came thither also and stirred up the people. And then immediately the brethren sent away Paul to go as it were to the sea, but Silas and Timotheus abode there still. And they that connected Paul brought him unto Athens. So we're just like following Paul's footsteps all the way down. Although Philippi, or we went to Kabbalah yesterday, then Philippi, then down to we noted Amphipolis and Apollonia, then came down to Thessaloniki, now we're down to Berea, and we're going to catch him up again in Athens. This last video is something that I did on the way to the Meteora Monasteries. The Meteora Monasteries are hundreds of years old. They're built they're perched on the top of rock cliffs, and they're just absolutely gorgeous. I actually have a video of a couple of those monasteries in an earlier video that I posted. And so this was on the way there. I just kind of wanted to help our tour folks to understand the importance of monasteries, where monasteries came from, and hopefully maybe a way that we could actually learn from them, ideally. So this was on a bus. We went through some tunnels, and so it's kind of a different one. But especially if you were on this trip and you wanted to see a recording of this, well, here's a recording of the talk that I gave about monasteries, where monasteries came from, and maybe a way to try to understand and learn from our visit to the monasteries. The monasteries were a beautiful place. I think most people enjoyed visiting there, but I'm just trying to help them learn as well while we're there. So we're as noted, we're going to these monasteries that date from the 14th to the 16th centuries, which so I'm always interested in what builders have to say when we visit there. And so I talked to Lyle about this already. I don't know if any of the rest of you are do construction. When we were here in 2015, there was a couple contractors, and I said, "So what do you think of this?" And he said, "I'm blown away. I can't, like, we would never do this today. I don't know how they do it." I'm not a builder, and I'm very, very impressed. So these are Orthodox monasteries, which in some ways are different than monasteries that we're familiar with in the West, with Catholic monasteries. But the idea is the same, is about the same. The reason why I chose Luke 4 is because Jesus' experience in the wilderness is, in a way, a model for monasteries. You go away into the wilderness by yourself, and you experience and you experience deprivation because of it. Obviously, you experience deprivation, but that deprivation brings growth, and you come out more powerful. You achieve power by going off by yourself and being deprived. I'm giving you, by the way, I'm giving you the rationale for this. I'm not, like, as I said, I'm not about to go off into a monastery for the rest of my life, but this is kind of the things that they would say, right? This is kind of the idea. And in fact, I think if you look through the scripture, there's a lot of examples of this type of thinking, that self-denial, taking up a cross, spending time alone in prayer, spending time alone in really deeply studying the Word, that these things bring growth. And so that's kind of the idea. It goes back to at least the 300s AD. What else happened that we talked about? What major shift happened in the 300s? Yep. So somebody up here has it. What happened in the 300s that was a huge shift in the church? Okay, Constantine.
Christianity became legal.
Yes, Constantine legalized the church. By the end of the century, the emperor had made Christianity essentially necessary. If you wanted to do anything in the world, in the Roman Empire, you had to be a Christian, basically. If you wanted political power, social power, whatever, it was the thing to do is to be a Christian. Which means within a century, the church expanded drastically. It expanded in a huge way. As everybody flooded into the church, be baptized and become Christian, because that's what you needed to do. And this brought about monasticism. For this reason, before Christianity was legalized, persecution was not constant. I think I mentioned this before. It was not constant, but there was at least a risk. There was always a risk about being a Christian. So in times of favor, if people weren't particularly interested in persecuting the church, then you did have people coming into the church because they thought it was really nice or whatever, and then persecution would arise and they would leave the church. I mentioned that with regard to the rise of penance. Remember that? I said penance came about because people during persecution would leave the faith, would renounce their faith, and then they would want back in when the persecution stopped. So it's not as though every single convert was all out, dedicated, committed to the faith before Constantine. But there was a certain level of, just because it was you against the world in many cases, because there was always the threat of persecution. A lot of people who came into the church before the legalization of Christianity were really serious about their faith. Very, very serious about their faith. And the church was very, very serious about making sure that if you are converted, that you know what you're getting into and you are very committed to it. The church was, in ways that I think would make many of us very, very uncomfortable, the church was dead set on, you have to be converted by the time you come into the church. We can talk about that later if you want, but okay. And then there's the idea that actually, if you're really a great Christian, you will be persecuted. If you're really a good Christian, you will be persecuted. And so, I think most people would say, in some very unfortunate ways, some early Christians would say, I want persecution. I want persecution. Because that's a way of actually demonstrating how serious I am. And that's a way of kind of demonstrating to the Lord how much I love Him. And it's just, right? So they actually looked forward to and sought persecution. Yesterday, when we sang Faith of Our Fathers, okay, I used to sing the whole hymn, and sometimes I still will. It's not a big deal to me. I don't like boycott this song. In fact, I asked that we could sing it. But Nancy asked me if I was going to sing verse 2. Maybe we should skip verse 2. And that's because of a conversation I had with a brother from Eastern Europe who'd been through communism. And this is out in Altadena. And I said, well, what do you think? You know, sometimes people will say, we kind of wish there was persecution in America so that it would kind of sober Christians up and make them more serious about their faith. And he said, I get the idea, but you never, ever seek persecution. Never do that. If you get persecution, God's grace will be there to get you through, but you don't tempt the Lord by saying, please bring it on. And I don't know, and it's spoken by somebody who went through serious persecution, like real life, honest to goodness, painful persecution. That really was impressed on me. So the second verse of Faith of Our Fathers says how wonderful it would be if our children could die for their faith. That is something that even in the early church leaders said you should not seek persecution. You shouldn't seek to do that. You shouldn't seek to die for your faith. You shouldn't seek it. If it happens, it happens, but you shouldn't seek it. So anyway, and that's just the perspective that some people have, and I think it's worthy of thinking, and so that's why I told it. Is because I think it was very interesting, and and so I said it to you because I thought it was worthy of thinking, and hopefully it will get like here again. In the meantime, I just told you that because I thought it'd be, useful for you to hear. So,
coming out of the darkness into the light.
Yes, are we soon? No. Okay, so anyway, so they said never seek persecution. Just don't do it. And so I thought I'd just tell you that. Just so that you would know it. Yeah, Vicky, did you hear that?
Yes.
Oh, you did? Okay, because I was going to repeat it for you. Yeah.
But hurry, because
Lead
we're
us
going
not into
into
temptation.
another. We're
Not into temptation.
We're going into
He said,
another one.
you're right. Jesus says, lead us not into temptation. You're right. So that's right from the Lord's mouth as well. So maybe it's not just a perspective.
We're going into another.
So anyway,
And so it goes.
so that's why I told you that.
I didn't understand, friend. They were going to be prosecuted, you said.
Yeah, that's right. Yes. So this is a little persecution of your own. I think Sal was trying to say.
Better hurry up because here comes the next
Okay.
one.
So anyway, so I got this one in my brain though. Don't worry about it. Okay, so two reasons why monasticism formed. One is because now you don't have persecution. So how do you prove your faith? How do you demonstrate your love for the Lord? If nobody cares whether you're Christian or not. In fact, if people want you to be Christian, then what? And so they had the idea of monasticism as a way of sort of demonstrating their faith. The second reason why they form monastic communities is because of disgust over the state of the church by the end of the 300s. By the end of the 300s, you have anybody and everybody coming into the church. And whether they were really serious about it or not, a lot of really committed Christians looked around and said, wow, we have like anybody and everybody in the church. And the standards have dropped drastically. And instead of going to these small communities where everybody is all out committed, now we're going to these huge assemblies. And they're living pretty much like the world has become the church. The church has become the world. And we don't like that. And we don't want church to be like that. So let's form small communities of people who are really all out committed like we are. And so they formed these communities. They either went off by themselves into the desert, or they went off with other people and formed monastic communities. So there are actually two different kinds of monasticism. One is the kind where you go off by yourself, like Jesus did, and spend time reading and praying by yourself and denying yourself. That was always one option. The other option would be to gather with like-minded people and live out your life in a community by yourself, encouraging each other. And so there are stories of both in monastic history. What people I think often don't realize is actually, especially the community groups. This is especially true of the monastic communities, such as what we're going to see here. They end up playing a really important role in everybody's lives through the Middle Ages. Before you have secular hospitals, you have monasteries. Before you have secular schools, you have monasteries. Before you have funeral homes, you have monasteries. Before you, the monasteries were centers of social, what we would call social services. And instead of looking to the government or to private business, you would look to the monasteries. And they did a tremendous amount of good helping people through the Middle Ages. Because part of being a monk for communities was not that you would just spend time in silence just reading and praying, but that actually you were supposed to do good in the community. You would live by a rule. In the East, it was St. Basil's rule, St. Basil's rule, St. Basil, which was, so in the West, it was St. Benedict. You may have heard of the Benedictine rule or St. Benedict's rule. St. Benedict's was more lined out exactly how you live your life. But if you look at his rules, how do you live your life? How should you live your life? It's things like spend X number of hours in prayer, study the Word of God, forgive other people, don't be selfish, I mean, things that come right out of the Bible itself. If like the first time I saw Saint Benedict's rule, I thought, okay, this is gonna be like some really hard, rigorous, and it's like, wow, this is like cut and pasted from the Bible, like things that every Christian should be living. And they said, but they will live in a community where that becomes like that's everything you do. All right, but part of it is helping the sick, so they would go around and help sick people. Part of it is visit those in prisons, so they would go around and visit those in prisons. Their lives are really, a monastery's life was meant to be pretty much just like what Jesus said, only like everybody's really, really, really serious about it. And you take vows of poverty and celibacy. In the East, they followed Saint Basil's rule, which added a little spice to the to their experience. Thank you. Thanks. Yeah. Okay. Yes, Saint Basil. Yeah. Just keeping you alive, keeping you awake. Not alive, but awake.
They're all just getting it.
Yeah. Oh, what do you say?
Keep it coming.
Yeah, keep it coming.
Oh, that was good.
Yeah, that was just in time too. Yep, we're done now. Okay. Let's see here. So, one other thing that you should know is that through the Middle Ages, as penance became a bigger thing, and as indulgences became a bigger thing. Going back to an earlier talk I talked about, the rise of penances. Remember that? Yes, no?
Yes.
Thumbs up,
Yes,
thumbs down?
yes.
Okay. And then indulgences, where you could get out of sin by paying the church. Well, one way that you do that is you donate money and land to a monastery. And so over time, many of the monasteries become fabulously wealthy. And they're landowners on which serfs, which are like bonded peasants, like you can't leave the land. You're almost like a slave. Serfdom has been compared to slavery. Many, like a huge percentage of European farmers were serfs, which means they didn't own their own land, they worked the land of a landlord. And in many cases, the landlords were monasteries, the people of a monastery. And so not only were they fabulously wealthy, but they were huge landowners, and many people were essentially slaves to the monasteries. They were serfs. It's better to say serfs, but to get to the oomph of it, you can think of them as slaves, right? Which means by the time of the Reformation, there was a lot of resentment against the monasteries. These folks are really, really rich. And they're not supposed to be rich, right? They took vows of poverty. But their monasteries are really, really rich. And people resent the fact that monasteries control the land, and that they can't have land unless they work for a monastery. So there's a lot of resentment there. Also, there was resentment that by Protestant reformers that, you know, guys, instead of having a special religious class of really dedicated Christians, and then everybody else, I mentioned that before, like, why isn't everybody living that way? Not with vows of celibacy. All the reformers said that's not right. Martin Luther said that he got married in order to please his father and spite the Pope. And so a lot of reformers actually got married just to say to the Pope, because a lot of them were monks that had taken vows of poverty. And when they became reformers, they're like, that was wrong. Nobody should ever have made me take a vow of poverty, or of chastity, I mean. That was a wrong vow. Anyway, so there was some resentment about that, but there was also, like, you know, we shouldn't have two classes of Christians. Everybody should live according to Christ, which is why the argument that I mentioned before, that in a sense, while Protestants did tear down monasteries, and while Protestant governments took property away from monasteries and gave it to private people, in a sense, monasticism became democratized. It became for everybody. And so Protestantism has been compared to like monasticism for everybody, monasticism for all. Okay, one last thing. I like visiting monasteries. For the same reason, I like visiting the Amish communities. I don't really like. Excuse me. Let me say it this way. I do not want to become an Amish or a monk. Sometimes when I'm really stressed, I do think about a monastery.
Thanks a lot.
If I could find, I know Nancy just said, "Well, thanks a lot." Well, I mean, if I could find one for couples, I would consider it. But I like to visit them. I like to visit Amish and I like to visit monasteries because while I have real trouble with the idea that you withdraw from the world, especially as most monasteries do today, right? These just sort of withdraw from the world, like these folks we're going to see. Jesus said to be in the world but not of the world. It seems like too often that lends itself to being out of the world and not of the world. And I just feel like we're called to be in the world. So it's hard for me to wrap my mind around really doing the monastic thing. And yet I envision them saying, I can envision me having a conversation with a monk and saying, you guys, you're supposed to be out in the world. You're supposed to be doing things, out among the world. You shouldn't be off by yourself on this mountaintop. And I can envision them saying, well, Fred, tell me about your prayer life. Like, are you all that much more godly? Get up in the morning, 5-minute prayer, rush off to work? Is that really what you American Christians call the godly life? Maybe we overdo it one way, but you guys overdo it the other way, don't you? And so in the end, I like to just sort of, again, suspend judgment and just go to these places and say, all right, what can I learn? Well, one thing I can learn is that you don't have to have all the modern conveniences and pleasures and riches and hectic lifestyle that I think I do. So I usually come away from an Amish community or one of these communities and like reevaluate my commitment to modern technology. I actually, after going to an Amish community, I dropped off of social media because it was just taking. I'm not saying anybody else should. I'm not saying you should. I'm not saying you should. I'm just saying for me it was like, man, it's just getting too much in my life, So anyway, that's what I like to do. I encourage you to just kind of think of it that way. Just kind of evaluate while you see their disengagement from the world. Let that check your engagement with the world. Is maybe one way of saying it. If you get a chance, try. There aren't many. At least there weren't when we were there. There weren't many monks standing around wanting to talk to people. But I did find one in 2015, and I asked our guide if she would interpret, and so we had a conversation together, and it was a really interesting conversation. I wondered. I'm always interested when I see people living a peculiar lifestyle like that. I'm always interested, like, what is your real faith? Like, what do you feel in your what do you think in your heart of hearts? What is your faith to you in your heart of hearts? Not like the outward stuff you do and the ceremonies and ritual, but like what's going on in here? What is it to you deep in your heart? And so that was kind of what I was driving at through an interpreter. I asked him, I think, why are you here? Or what does this do for your faith or something? I can't remember the exact question. And he said, it is easier to fight my battles up here. Which I thought was a really interesting way of saying, because I could see that, right? I could see being up there, it'd be easier to fight the battles. And I sympathize with that. I'm still not sure that's why we should withdraw from the world. But it was an honest answer and one that I can respect, right? And I look at some of our men in our church who have serious struggles in certain ways, and I think maybe they should go up on the top of a hill by themselves, and then their battles will be easier to fight. I'm not going to recommend it, but I don't know. I sympathize with that. I can see the sense behind it. So anyway, all right. Well, thank you for listening. What's that?
See the engagement. Think of my engagement with the world. What was the first part of that?
As I critique their disengagement.
Disengagement.
from the world, I want to let what I see critique my engagement with the world.